And we're live, apparently. There we go. Hopefully, all things working normal tonight. If anybody's out there in YouTube land, thanks very much for joining us. We had a bit of a night here last night, and the weather still continues to be pretty bad. I hope you can all hear me if you're listening out there. If anybody pops in, give us a wee thumbs up if you can hear what I'm saying. I'm getting a wee green light on my microphone. So, in Northern Ireland last night, we got hit by Storm Arwen. Um, First big storm of the year, I suppose. And I think we've even had a fatality here with it. So it was very nasty, very rough last night. I'm just going to turn this camera around a wee bit. We're in the doghouse, settle myself up a wee bit. There's Babs. Hello, Babs. How are you? Thanks very much for joining us. Sorry. There we go. So, yeah, it's very, very glad you can hear me, Babs. I hope you're keeping well. Excuse me. I'm going to put my wee watching my bobicles on here. Bear with me. Because I'm a bit of a smoker, I have to say. I'm about to try and give up, but because a cough's actually partly through smoking, partly from being a bit ill for a recent while. Um, but I put these wee things on and cough into them. Actually, it's quite handy for covering the noise on the microphone. But yeah, thanks very very much for joining us. We tried to do a live stream last night twice, and the power was going in the house. I think we just sort of kind of got going. We got questions sort of asked about mythology, and everything went kaput. And we've had a very funny week here. We've had a massive explosion at a derelict factory across the road from us, which has released a toxic cloud of ammonia and asbestos as well. So yeah, that happened at the start of our week. We've had the fire's been burning for about 3-4 days. It's just gone down a bit, but if you go outside, you can. We've had the police and fire brigade telling us all to stay inside for the last few days, seal all our doors and windows, etc., etc. So it's been a bit of a funny week, to be honest with you. And it's very, very stormy here still, but the wind has calmed down. But the temperature has dropped rightly, and I've just had the dogs out there about half an hour ago, and we got up hailstones all over the place. So we had the run, actually have a bit of a run back, which is probably quite good for my lungs. Excuse me. So yeah, thanks for joining us, folks. If you've got any questions, as usual, fire away. And we've been chatting away, Babs, about doing this, sort of as requested, I think, about the whole thing to do with the Atreides family and the myth of the curse of the House of Atreus and the various myths that surround what I would call the Pelopid Line. And the family of Pelops and so on. So we've been working away at it, Babs, and the project turned out to be quite big, I think. So I was a bit concerned about what to do with it, and then chatting with yourselves last week, chop it up. So I've at the minute we have 45 minutes of I suppose this episode is at the minute it's going to be three sort of 15-minute episodes, and it's going to take us all the way through the Pelopid Line. And I thought it was useful for breaking it up a bit because, particularly when dealing with Greek mythology, the names, people's names, can be a bit of a problem. Oh, I hope you enjoyed it, Babs. And it sort of, I just went with a natural stop, basically. So I was trying to see how best to divide it. So I think there's not much point in trying to show how these stories work in Dune if nobody understands them, or if we don't know the devil's in the detail. And I suppose that they're reiterative, and though that they're quite variable, as I said, it's not the same story told over and over again. But they're an really interesting family from Greek history, Greek mythology, and yeah, I've kind of enjoyed doing this, but at the same time, it's been a bit of a headache trying to get the right kind of material for visuals. If you see what I mean, to go with what I'm doing with the narration. And I think the trick with these kind of stories is it's hard to, genealogically speaking, maybe hard to pull. Let's look at one thread of stories out of Greek mythology, because they tend to move all over the place. And as much as there are a number of other myths surrounding these, the Pelopids, we're trying to stick to the real kind of genealogical line here, from father to son to grandfather, etc. And I think we cover about 5 to 6 generations of the Pelopids before they're done, basically. And they're really interesting, and there's a whole lineup into real history, and we have them fundamentally attached to the Trojan War, as well as other events in Greek mythological history, if you like. And they're an interesting bunch, and they're quite a savage bunch. And I'll tell you something, Babs, it's quite interesting. We're looking, in particular, we start off with Tantalus. And Tantalus is not the source of the curse of the House of Atreus, if you like. I'd seen a couple of videos that suggested that he was, and they're quite wrong. And it was kind of one of the things that made me want to kind of do this. The punishment of Tantalus is a very specific thing, and the gods deal with him. End of story. If that curse was to follow on to his son, which is Pelops, it's not actually the case. The gods actually bring Pelops back to life and endow him with magical shoulder and gifts, etc., out of pity. So the curse doesn't come from what the gods do to Tantalus, and it's a common misconception because we think of a curse in terms of a family line with these guys. And in particular, I suppose, once you get through that and then realize that the source of the actual curse is a charioteer called Myrtilus, and it's really interesting if you can look into these kind of stories further, and in terms of if you can approach them from, say, a mythological aspect, what they have to do with ritualistic practices, human sacrifice, all of these kind of weird things. And a lot of these stories actually show you a transition between, I suppose, one kind of religious way of looking at the world and another. In particular, the stories that are associated with I suppose we have infanticide, devouring your own children, etc. This kind of thing really much associated with the practice of human sacrifice, which ultimately is slowly coming to an end in this part of the world. So there's a fundamental reality behind a lot of the stories that's quite interesting. But what I wanted to say to you, and this takes us into the Trojan War, was just, I suppose, the idea that the past is fluid is something that I understand very well, and our knowledge changes on a daily basis. And as much as there are people out there in the world trying to destroy artifacts and so on, so that they can create a new narrative, what emerges on a daily basis is we learn more about the ancient world every day based on things that we can find. And what's really good is 2 days ago, I think, there's just a news story on the BBC if you want to check it out. There's been an archaeological find of a Roman mansion in Rutland, and it has a fully intact, if you go to the BBC News website, they have an article on this, a fully intact, it's a Roman villa, but it's got a fully intact mosaic, and they reckon it's the first ever mosaic found complete like this in a Roman villa that's actually of a scene from it's two chariots going at each other, and I think it's meant to be, as far as I understand, Hector and Achilles going at each other. So my understanding is it's the first time ever we've found a mosaic like this that has a representation of a scene from Homer in Britain. So it's a moment of note in the study of Roman Britain, I suppose, and it's quite relevant to what we're talking about, particularly the chariot cults and stuff that are in and around places like excuse me, Ellis and Pisa, not to be confused with the other Pisa, by the way. So if I just thought very interesting if you have a look at that. And I love this kind of stuff, and I was just kind of having a nosy as I do at the news, went, ooh, chariots. And I suppose one of the things that's difficult about doing this work is finding the relevant source material to put into the images, to try and get as many artifacts that are relevant, I suppose. So for example, we have the genuine Mount Sipylus in there and so on. So there's lots of aspects to these myths, and what there's a reality behind them, I suppose. There are different schools of people who study mythology, and within the classical, I'm not really bothered about such things, but I'm what you would call a euhemerist, or what some people would call a euhemerist, which means that I fundamentally believe that there's a reality behind all myths, that there's some kind of truth to the stories that they have. There's a basis of reality in their origin, So it's been enormous fun doing these videos, and we've had to split them into three so far. But I've decided to extend it on and write a little bit extra, and push. So I'm going to add. At the minute, it's going to take three videos. The same. We'll have one out each week. I said they've all been written. We're just putting them up together and stuff. And I thought it'd be a bit much to take all of these names and places, particularly, they're quite strange names. Sometimes, to take all that in at once. And I suppose if you can get a sense of how dense this story is of the Pelopid Line, how it applies to sort of Dune by the time we're through, you'll get that level of complexity and detail and plans within plans and things like that. So I hope you enjoyed the video, Babs. As I said, we just stop at the natural point with Pelops, and then we're going to go on to his son next week. His children, Atreus and Thyestes. And we'll also cover Agamemnon and Menelaus up to the Trojan War, I think. And then we'll take the third episode, we'll take the family through the Trojan War, not in any great detail because that would just take years, but just some key events to do with key individuals, what their nonsense is, I suppose, in terms of the gods, and down through to Orestes. And the end of these stories does kind of end up in Greek and Roman drama, because we have an awful lot, I suppose, an awful lot lost to us, I suppose, but even though there's quite a fair bit of this stuff remains. And a lot of these mythographers themselves are working over maybe about 900 years in the ancient world. So yeah, if you have any questions, by the way, Babs or anybody else, fire away. And I said that the idea, I suppose, just whatever you want to talk about tonight, the idea, I suppose, is about using this thing to build up the character of Paul Atreides and his family. And the tie into Dune is neat, especially when it sheds light on the hidden storylines. Well, the interesting thing is, I suppose, none of it's too obvious, Babs. Herbert borrows from quite a lot of things, and he's subtle in how he does it. And to be honest with you, it's an absolute trait of a lot of science fiction writers. Probably a lot of fantasy writers too, I'd argue, that they do borrow heavily from mythology and reshape it and reform it, and will set it in the future, and generally hope that nobody recognizes too much what they're up to. But it's not a new thing. You'll find Shakespeare does it quite a lot. For example, I couldn't get too many pictures of too many images to do with Hippodamia, which would, and she has a cult, I suppose, associated with hippodromes and so on, to do with chariot racing, because of this story. Not too easy to get too many. We've got a couple of images of her, but I ended up using some pictures of, I suppose I was trying to get some pre-Raphaelite stuff of Lady Macbeth in her place. I suppose almost the murder of Laius and Chrysippus, in some ways you could overlay that onto Macbeth, for example. And I would argue that Hamlet is pretty much Hamlet is very much the retelling of the Oresteia, I think. So it's nothing new. But there is, and I think somebody was asking me the other night about, I suppose it was an interesting question. I got asked before we got cut the other night, that I think someone was asking me, do you think that people who read science fiction in the 60s and 70s would be aware of kind of the Greek myths, etc.? Do you need to be aware of these kind of myths to kind of figure this stuff out? I'm not too sure, but I kind of figured that a lot of the point about the Greek myths, a lot of them is that they're, and if you take the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're what we call the canon of Western literature. They're fundamental to Western civilization and our society. And I suppose the idea I thought was that, and it's maybe a modern thing, that most of us understood, what an Achilles heel is, for example, what a Trojan horse is. That we have a fundamental association with these stories through metaphor, and that metaphor often leads us to a further understanding of the stories, I suppose. It's a thing you find in Shakespeare a fair bit. Excuse me. And I'm not a big fan of Shakespeare, to be honest with you. But both Macbeth and Hamlet, as I've pointed out before, are both sort of written in the same sort of propaganda-ish vein that, for example, Virgil's Aeneid is written in. Um, and if you think about what we're talking about here, Babs especially, it's to do with lineage, and this is a common thing. Um, hmm. So and it actually takes us all the way back into these stories. Would you believe it or not? If Macbeth and King Lear is supposed to show descent of the English and Scottish monarch James I, James VI, as a descendant of both Banquo and Lear, which is to do with being that makes him a descendant of Brutus, and that takes you all the way back to the siege of Troy and Aeneas and the people that fled from the siege whenever the city fell. So there's so many different myths and tied in with it. And I thought, I don't know, maybe you guys can tell me, or is kind of the knowledge of the Greek myths a thing of the past and in the general consciousness, if you see what I mean. And I think it is the case, especially I talk to my younger students, I go, oh, you've heard of Jason and the Argonauts, haven't you? No, I haven't a clue who you're talking about. What about them? But some of them, Hercules and even things like the Arabian Nights, I suppose, survive in, like Disney films like Aladdin and stuff like that. But no, it's if you think about the sort of elements that make up the story, and it's a bit of a nightmarish story. It's and Lear's got a lot, like there's a lot of Oedipus in Lear as well, by the way, Babs. Yeah, I actually only read Lear a couple of years ago. And I had my first introduction to King Lear is through the Akira Kurosawa film Ran, which is really good. If I've picked the right film. I've lost all my Akira Kurosawa films, all but two, sadly. It's gutting. I must replace them. But yeah, Shakespeare's a Renaissance plagiarist. He's at it all the time, And so if you take, as I said, that the overlap of these stories, by the time we get through them, Babs, if you're familiar with the whole Pelopid line, I suppose, by the time you get to Orestes and understand, if you think about Hamlet as a prince returning home, father's brother's hooked up with his mother, murdered his brother, blah blah blah, vengeance forced on him by a ghost, by the supernatural. It's pretty much a retelling of the Oresteia. Hamlet is Orestes, arguably, and there's plenty of references to all sorts within Shakespeare. But yeah, I don't know, Hyperion to a satire, that kind of thing. I think it was I chatting about the to be or not to be speech, referencing the, and I think almost it's a thing that goes over almost everybody's head, that it's at the start of that speech is referencing the 10,000. There's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. What are you going to do about it? And if you know the Anabasis, that's referencing Greek history, I suppose. But yeah, what is it about King Lear that you like, Babs? I think it's a pretty good play. It's I think the plays that I like best by Shakespeare are the ones that have a supernatural element. Lear in particular, and I'd say Macbeth is probably my favorite Shakespeare play. Excuse me, but I quite like The Tempest. I have to say. But yeah, and there's even Lear is actually an Irish king, by the way, Babs. If the children of Lear, if you know that story, he's the same king. Spell his name a wee bit differently. It's a common done thing, I think. Commonly done thing, I think is the better way to put that. But yeah, and as I said, if you look at Shakespeare bouncing around between the kind of Akira Kurosawa kind of thing with Shakespeare, and you've even got those kind of recreations between the westerns and the Japanese films. There's Brad. Hi Brad. Hey guys, been here listening. Busy morning. Was Frank interested in Greek mythology before writing Dune, or was it because of Dune that he looked into it? It's a good question, but I think he was definitely into there is a we chat a bit about it. That he's very much into Carl Jung, and the link to mythology is there. And I think if you go back to some of my old Dune videos, particularly where we look at Jung and Lord Raglan, and we look at Joseph Campbell together, and the way I looked at it, it was, and there's other mythographers there too, by the way, but it was particularly about which ones Frank was using, and I considered Carl Jung a mythographer, and a bad one at that I suppose. But it's an attempt to, these guys sort of start approaching myth and looking at it in an attempt to create a universal systemic way of approaching myth, which is deeply flawed. So I think the whole point about that, and it shows in Frank's work, is that these other gentlemen's work is about finding universality, that all of the stories in the world are the same no matter where you go, and they're badly wrong. But it depends on what you think about it. I'm not too sure. It's. I think I was asked the other night. It was June Scholar was on, which is Dr. Cara Kennedy, asked me about how much people in America in the 60s and 70s would get. Yeah, I think that the sense was a contemporary Dune reader at the time. How much would you get? And Lord of the Rings being reasonably new. And I don't know. I kind of grew up with an interest in Greek mythology and that kind of thing because of things like Ray Harryhausen films, like Jason and the Argonauts, not necessarily Hercules Returns, that kind of thing, but yeah, cinema being what it was, I suppose, in the old days. But yeah, I think it's the general sense is that most of us maybe know the terms, but we don't know the stories behind them anymore. But we know to tantalize someone is is a kind of torment, doesn't it? But it's very obvious. I suppose the Pelopid line makes up the bulk of the main, what we consider the main set of Greek myths at this point in terms of the Trojan War. I think are the ones that most people are familiar with. But in particular, what we have, I suppose, within what's going on within Dune is prophecy, prescience, foresight, and familial homicide, and very much a political intrigue. SM photography during the school holidays. SM photography. Can you expand that? I'm not too sure what that means. SM photography. Sounds rude, bro. Stop motion. Yes, thank you. Okay, got you. Right. Yes, indeed. The Ray Harryhausen stuff. It's interesting that the films that he worked on are sort of known by his name rather than anything else. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm laughing too. Sorry. Sometimes the brain just doesn't make the connections. You know what I mean? As much as I'm talking about something, I'm trying to catch up something, going, oh, put it in context. That's better just to ask, I think, Brad, and not worry about it too much. I'm laughing too. Yeah, stop motion. It's great. I've actually got I've got a few wee bits of equipment. I'd love to do some kind of animation or something like that. Somebody created quite a good wee animation, something to do with Pelops. I think it was a Rembrandt or something, cooking a kid in a pot there, and I threw it into the video. I thought it was very good and quite appropriate, But it's very much there, and I suppose it's been around for a long, long time. And I can think of all sorts that Greek mythology informs within science fiction. Well, I tend to think of Roman mythology as kind of it's the same stuff, really. There's some slight variations, but yeah, it's. I mean, as I said, the name Atreides, straight off the bat, House Atreides, ping, and it should be the Atreides, Agamemnon, or Menelaus, take your pick. But that should bring up Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, if you like. The sacrifice at Aulis, the fall of Troy, the wooden horse, the plague, and the divine shenanigans of the gods. And what you'll find is as we go along, that almost all of these actions are caused by seeking prophecy. And seeking foreknowledge of the future, prescience, and it's a thing that happened for real in the Greek world. And there are many historic events that have occurred because somebody decided to go to the oracle at Delphi and seek, divine inspiration. Um, that could be quite interesting. So yeah, it's I suppose that it's the Trojan War stories and the Helen of Troy that's the most romantic, I suppose. But they're a horrible bunch of stories. Um, it's quite interesting. My wife was finding some of the stuff quite hard to take, and we were laughing about it. And I was going, "What? We've got incest, murder, familial homicide, chopping up, murdering your kids, eating them. Word of it, blasphemy, blah blah blah." And I was saying, it's just like another day in Northern Ireland. It doesn't faze me at all. And I suppose maybe that's a comment on how horrific my own society is. But and interestingly enough, I think I've pointed out, I was working through I have a rather thick book on the Icelandic sagas, it is enormous. And I'd say it's over 1,000 pages, and I find them particularly violent. And it's not that I enjoy violence. I don't. I'm exactly the opposite. I hate violence. But I sort of approach the books from a cultural viewpoint, I suppose. But even the Iliad itself and the Odyssey, there's levels of violence in them that are gruesome, and I suppose they're for dramatic effect. Beth, although he didn't see the prophecy, he and his wife seek from Macbeth. Yeah. As I said, I used some of the images there, Brad. From I tried to just I couldn't think of who to use for Hippodamia, and then there are different versions of that murder of Chrysippus. I'm trying to stick to only one or two with any given story so as not to confuse. And whenever I do put in tangential myths, they'll have payoff later, if you see what I mean. It's the ones that. So Chrysippus is quite an important. His murder is very important. And it is, yeah, absolutely. And that's why I did a wee quick search on, try and find some pre-Raphaelite images of Lady Macbeth. And that's what I went with. There's a lot of similarity to the story. Although he didn't seek the prophecy, he and his wife seek the fulfillment of them. I've taught Macbeth a few times, and I've been to the Macbeth Museum, Brad, which is up in goodness, let me see, Forres, is it up by Kinloss in Scotland? I went up and stayed there for a while. The Macbeth Museum, I think, if it hasn't changed, it was sort of museum dedicated to the historical Macbeth, but also to some kind of big white game hunter, if you know what I mean, from the local area, from who'd kind of, if I can recall correctly, it's all the other half of the museum is kind of like a natural history museum with various things that this guy shot. Yeah, there's very much a supernatural element to Macbeth, and like Lear, I suppose that this goes back to Oedipus as well. There's the question of, do you blame Macbeth or not? It's arguably it's interesting because basically the witches aren't witches. The three their stage names are first witch, second witch, and third witch, but they don't describe themselves as witches. They don't refer to themselves as witches. They're the Morai. So they're the Greek fates, if you like. And I must have a wee look at it again. But it's the same as it's about something against nature and the supernatural aspect. I know I'm probably rambling here, but I had a specific point to make. But it's kind of free will, I suppose, is the interesting thing. But both it's interesting that both plays that show a distortion in nature with these are the two plays that are to do with royalty and creating lineage, I suppose. There's a good wee comedy show on here at the minute on the BBC. Well, it's been on for a wee while, and it's called Upstart Crow. I think I suppose it's kind of maybe it is by the people that did Blackadder, I don't know, but it's David Mitchell as Shakespeare, and it's I suppose it's a sitcom, and I suppose in the mode of Blackadder, but like it's about Shakespeare. It's quite funny, and I'd say it gives gives you quite good insight into Shakespeare himself. Didn't seek the prophecy. He and his wife seeked the fulfillment. Yeah, I suppose wish fulfillment, all that they desire. But you could argue that it would all come to Macbeth anyway. If the prophecy goes, he should just do nothing, and some of it does. So their actions, I suppose. It's also got to do with Elizabeth I. I think there's a political motivation within the play as well. I think it's pretty interesting, actually. I don't know about you, Brad, what you think your favorite version of Macbeth is, but I've got two that I really like, and the first one is the Orson Welles one. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on YouTube, I think, for free. Excuse me. The black and white one. I think it's really atmospheric. But Throne of Blood, I think, is fantastic. The Akira Kurosawa does Shakespeare really well, and it is a good example of how you can lift stories from one culture very easily and transpose them into another culture. You have to kind of know. You could watch Throne of Blood if you hadn't read Shakespeare much or didn't know much about Shakespeare. You would be none the wiser, would you? But it's things like I suppose if you think about the kidnapping of Helen of Troy, that could line up with the kidnapping of Yui's wife. Yui himself is a Trojan horse, if you like. There's things that happen in the Dune series that are they're not obvious, but they're analogues to events. Sometimes they're inverted, I think I was trying to say. For example, whenever Paul is about to start the big final battle in Dune, and I kind of quote this in a couple of episodes down, and so on. So we'll take the goal is hopefully to give you full knowledge of the Pelopid Line and all these weird and wacky stories that are quite horrific. And there is real devil in some of the details, if you know what I mean, in some of these stories, particularly to do with the murder of the rape of Pelopids, and later on the murder of Agamemnon. And it's not just the Pelopid Line themselves; it's the divine influence around them. So there's the various gods that act within these stories are overlaid on the Atreides as well. So, for example, Leto the First is there's aspects of Agamemnon and I suppose to a degree maybe Thyestes a bit. He's not a particularly nice guy, Leto the First, but then he's also got the divine Leto overlaid on top of him, and there is a gender inversion with the name. But the children of Leto are Apollo and Artemis, and that they're very much Paul and Alia. And whenever Leto's parenting, I suppose, motherhood is called into question, the main thing is that she tends to send out her divine children to slaughter everyone involved. So that Apollo and Paul and Alia representing Apollo and Artemis. Very much so. It's bad for the whole population of the Imperium. And I suppose the other thing about the Iliad and the Odyssey in these stories is they're all about the heroic, the great people. There's no little people in them at all, Unfortunately, I have things to do, so I'll be unavailable to reply, but I'll be listening. No worries, Brad. I'm just going to run along for a wee hour tonight. As I said, just thought I hadn't planned on doing a sci-fi Saturday, but I thought it'd be a science fiction Friday. But because we got stormed out last night, I thought I thought I'd pop on, just do the usual, because I quite enjoy it. It's something to do at the minute. And yeah, we have been literally locked in the house, and not because of COVID, all week. So and the air is I just out with the dogs. The air is actually still quite bad over at the outside, with the embers burning from this place. So we've had a bit of heavy rain and storms and stuff, and battered by the wind, etc. So hopefully it'll do a bit of cleansing good in the air. Be nice. It's been really weird not just being able to open the windows up for a bit of fresh air and stuff. So there we go. But yeah, if anybody's got any questions about these myths or having to do with Dune, fire away, or anything science fictiony at all. I think I called the the idea for the chat tonight was building the perfect beast, which I don't know where that came from. I think it's a Don Henley album or something. It's an album title. But in constructing Paul Atreides as a hero and having a deliberate desire to construct him, as a hero of heroes almost, then the place arguably to look is the heroic age. Within Paul, as I said, we can see, and it's not just the good ones. It's not, there's Orestes. I'd say Paul is very heavily influenced by Orestes and plagued by the fates, etc., familial revenge. But he's also very much Agamemnon. As I said, we talked about that. If you think about the sacrifice at Aulis, which will be in next week's video, when we get to it's all to do with the curse of Atreus. We're hitting Atreus and Thyestes, and then we're hitting Atreus' kids after that. And that would be the Atreides in this case, I suppose. And again, it shows you Herbert taking the story, if you like, and he flips it. Where, I suppose, in the myth, it's the war machine. The Greek war machine is becalmed, and its leaders go about sacrificing a child, in order to get the war going. In the final battle, I suppose, in Dune, it's the opposite. There's no calm. It's a great storm that's coming to drive the battle and to breach the shield wall, and we have this bit where Paul will not move. He's becalmed, if you like, and even it's even where people are, would you not come on? It's no, and he's waiting for that moment of sacrifice, and it comes in over the radio. I suppose that baby Leto's dead, Ali is captured, etc. And he's completely. That's his point where, boom, I'm ready to go now. And because of his prescience, he's allowed that sacrifice to happen. So it's the same kind of thing, and I suppose that's how Herbert takes these ideas. And you should know at that point, Atreides, that's what an Atreides does: sacrifices its own children for the war effort, if you see what I mean. Which is quite horrific. I suppose the funny thing about the sacrifice at Alice is, and I suppose Paul's identified as being a 15-year-old boy in Dune, and particularly within the Trojan War, the first great command of Achilles is the Trojan fleet, and he's given it at 15. There's aspects of, no, I wouldn't say too much of Achilles on him. Excuse me. But the hero, Paul's a hero surrounded by heroes, if you see what I mean. But sorry, I lost my train of thought there. We were talking, the sacrifice at Aulis isn't the first time that the Greeks pull into the port of Aulis. And I think because they don't really know how to get to Troy, they, under Achilles' command, I think they end up sailing all over the place and then pull back in there again to sort their stuff out. So it's kind of the Trojan War has depending on different versions, I suppose, which version you read, but there's one version that suggests it's a 20-year war, not a 10-year war, because they get lost quite badly, which I think is quite funny. So there you go. So if you've got any questions about these Pelopids or the I suppose I'll let you know where we're going with them. So just to show you the full Pelopid line that we'll be covering is we've started with Tantalus, and then we've covered Pelops in this first video. And then the next video next week will be Atreus himself and Thyestes. And this is a sort of tit-for-tat brother feud that goes back and forth and is quite horrific. Involves all sorts, incest, murder, cannibalism, the blasphemy, the lot. And we really get to see how quite nasty these Greeks are, in particular, these kings. And out of that, then again, this will have all sorts of, it'll set up the sort of great avenger, if you like, within this house, which is Aegisthus, and that takes us into the next generation, which is Agamemnon and Menelaus, who are two brothers who cooperate. So they're not the same as their father and his brother. They very much work together, and one's king of Mycenae, one's king of Sparta. Excuse me. And that takes us into the narrative of the Trojan War. Various children coming off both groups, I suppose, and different wives as well. And then we get to because Agamemnon murders his own daughter, that has consequences for when he gets home. So he has other children, of course, and the main one is that now we look at Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, and then we look at Orestes, which is the son of Agamemnon, who avenges his father's murder by killing his mother and ultimately Aegisthus. And all of these things are linked into prophecy. And almost each one of these, almost every one of these, I think all of them actually at some point visit an oracle, seek out prophecy and prescience from the oracle at Delphi, which is the god of prophecy is Apollo in Greek mythology. So we have a certain interaction with these families. Sorry, and then I nearly lost my train of thought. Once we get through to Orestes, the curse is supposed to end with Orestes, but it actually doesn't. So what we also do is we take you into the last historical king of the Pelopid line, which is Tisamus. Sorry, it's not Tisamus. Sorry, that's the wrong guy. Tisaminus or Tisaminus, depending on how you want to pronounce his name. Some of these ones are tricky, and with him, we'll basically see the end of the Pelopid line, and arguably whenever you line these myths up with Greek history and events in archaic Greece, this is a civilizational battle war, if you like, and it has massive consequences, and ultimately, if you take away the mythological overlap, the divine overlap of the action over the siege of Troy, for example, this it's not really to do with Troy; it's to do with the whole war along the coast in that region. It's to do with trade routes to the east, I think, but it ultimately ends with a civilizational collapse, what we call the Mycenaean collapse, the Bronze Age collapse, if you like, and it's simply a horrific wars of attrition, really over such a long period of time. It causes basically other peoples to move in and take over the place, and we get what we call the Greek Dark Ages, and it has an effect that's something similar to, I suppose, what we have is the war generation that we lost in the 20th century, and then the knock-on effect of population issues and then economic issues and then baby booming and all of this kind of thing. It's something similar that happens for real. I think there's a reasonable attempt to date these things. I think it's around 1170 we're talking about, if I'm not mistaken. There's a really good lecture online if anybody's not seen it, and I think it's a guy called Ernest Cline, and I don't mean the science fiction writer, if that's his name or is it something, but I don't think I have it bookmarked here, sadly. There's a chap that does a lecture on the Bronze Age collapse on YouTube, and he's really good. It's an excellent lecture. There's a couple of people who kind of do these kind of things, and they're not all that good at them. His is really good, and he's engaging enough without wanting to be your best buddy, but at the same time he's quite open and what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, he's good to listen. He's entertaining, but he's very factual. Check it out if you're interested. Excuse me. So yeah, you'll find lots of analogs in literature to almost all sorts of stuff from Greek and Roman mythology. Some of it gets lost. Again, Europe has its own dark ages. What we call them, the Middle Ages or the medieval times, if you like. And often information comes back and stories return. So you start to see things like these and Chaucer and stuff like this, and as you move forward, but really a lot of this stuff turns up in the Renaissance. And yeah, I don't know. The book, I said, I'll just show it to you. I think I mentioned it. If you're interested in Greek mythology, this is Apollodorus's library of Greek mythology. Some people call it pseudo Apollodorus. And its other name is the Bible, actually, because it's a library. It's a very good book it's the oldest extant collection of work on Greek myths by a Greek. Pardon me. Excuse me. And I have another one. Mine's a bit battered, I'm afraid, but there are different versions of these. But these are really good. Highly recommend. If you're interested in mythology and want a really thorough, in fact, Graves kind of works in the same way as Apollodorus. These Greek Myths version, volume 1 and 2 by Robert Graves. Couldn't recommend them more. In fact, you can often get really pretty, bargain books. What do you call them? Things like the works and stuff. Where you would get nice copies of The Art of War and things like that. You often can get really nice versions of those. But if you get a good one, the Penguin ones, they're very heavily annotated. Have regional variations of myths and stuff like that. And if you're really interested, I suppose, the source for a lot of the main sources for the final kind of parts of the story of the Pelopids are from Greek and Roman drama. So my very this doesn't look too bad on the screen. My very messy copy of Aeschylus is the Oresteia. So that's the Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Eumenides, and that's those. We'll be mentioning these in the next videos. You can often see these plays about, I think. We've a couple by Euripides as well. Did I fish Euripides out at all? Have I got a copy of Euripides? Let me see. I thought I did. But yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. And the Trojan War sort of moves on out into, in particular, if you're something I could recommend if you're into is Dan Simmons's Ilium, and it has a sequel called Olympus. They're 2 books, and you're getting good 640 odd pages for your money there. And it's a kind of, from my point of view, I really enjoyed it because it's sort of it's got different things going on in it, but the idea is that the Trojan War is recreated on Mars using sort of AI and things like this, allowing future historians to study it. And it gets a bit out of hand, but the overlap of the intertextuality and knowledge of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the other stories around the Trojan War, things like the Homeric hymns by Dan Simmons is really good, and it makes a really interesting set of science fiction novels. It's got some good ideas in it, Moravec and stuff like that. And again, I think Odysseus is a hero in it. But yeah. So if anybody got any questions or wee comments, I don't know, fire away. But as I said, it's a lot of it to come. So we'll go through the entire Pelopid line, and there is actually a lot of how would we say, the Agenorid line, to do with Polytrides as well. It's to do with Theban mythology. So I think Herbert borrows heavily from all sorts of stuff, and you'll find. I suppose it's interesting that you'll find stories from Greek mythology in the Bible, for example. What's a good one? We're going to get to this. One of the things that the feud to do with Atreus and his brother Thyestes is to do with which one of them will be king. And there's a contest. So it's to do with golden fleeces, believe it or not. But then Atreus loses because Thyestes has stolen this golden fleece because he's having an affair with his wife. And the gods tell Atreus basically to go and say to him, look, I want to be king again. I challenge you. Whichever one of us can set the sun back in the sky, and it's by 10 degrees, he should be king. And Thyestes thinks this is highly unlikely, so agrees to it. And it's a link to do with kings being astronomers in the ancient world. But according to the story, Thyestes, with the help of Zeus and Hermes and Helios and all the Pleiades and stuff, sets the sun back 10 degrees. And for the first time and last time in human history, the sun set in the east. That's the story of Atreus and Thyestes. You'll find the same story in the Bible, to do with what's called the Dial of Adas, which is exactly, and funny enough, it mentions the same details. The sun goes back 10 degrees. And there must, the difference in time. It's a story to do with Hezekiah, I think. The difference in time between the two stories is clearly the Greek one's the original. So this happens a lot. And funny enough, if you think about it, Atreus, Adeus, in the is it? Here, let me see. Hang on, what's the guy's name? The Dial of the Dial. Oh, for goodness sake, Google your rubbish. The Dial of Ahaz. The Ahaz. Bear with me a second. Oh, for goodness sake, Ahaz. Yes, it's the Dial of Ahaz after the king of Judah, who supposedly invented the sundial in the 8th century before Christ. Well, if we date Atreus, if he's the father of Agamemnon, then we can date him to the 12th century BC, which is quite interesting. Sorry, hang on, there we go. So Ahaz, if you think about it, is very close to Atreus, isn't it? In terms of sort of syllabic pronunciation, I suppose. So I'll just chat away for another 10 minutes, folks. I suppose we'll take it up to midnight, and because I've got plenty more work to be getting on with for the next video, and we'll do this again next week. But as I said, if you do have any questions, fire away. The whole set of myths and then the events around them then brings in the divine set of stories as well. And once we understand that, for example, the Bene Gesserit, in the appendices, you'll find what's the whole point of a Kwisatz Haderach. What are they up to? They want to renew the human race by war. It's as simple as that. They want to wipe most of the human race out to reinvigorate those that survive. It's very much a survival of the fittest kind of thing. The Trojan Wars started for the same reason, pretty much. Zeus wants, depending on which version of the story we read, to either wipe. There's a prophecy to do with one of Zeus's kids that will surpass him, and he doesn't know which one. And unfortunately, the world is populated with demigods, and the gods have been breeding with the heroes quite a lot. So depending on which version of the stories you read, the Trojan War is either set up by Zeus, and how he sets it up is quite. This is your plan within a plan within a plan. He starts with a wedding. I'm going to invite. I'm going to get all my. I want to kill all my children. How I'm going to do it is I'm going to have a wedding, and I'm not. And the nature of the plan then is I'm not going to invite one person. The one person that I'm not going to invite is the goddess Eris, the goddess of discord, pure chaos, and I'm going to let her do this. And it's a manipulation on so many levels that results in the Trojan War happening. Excellent, says Zeus, because now whichever one of these kids is supposedly going to surpass me and kill me, he's down there somewhere, and they're all going to slaughter each other. So the provides that the Trojan Wars created to slaughter as many of the children of Zeus as possible is one of those stories. Excuse me. The other is that he creates the war through the same process to elevate all of these demigods and quasi-deities, if you like, to divine status by creating a war that's so amazing that their names will last forever, this kind of thing. So there are lots and lots of things, I think. Herbert's subtle in what he takes, and particularly when it involves prescience, prophecy, vendettas, fighting within the family, familial homicide, all of these aspects, and the knowledge that the Atreides within the Dune universe are connected to this family, and that, I suppose, if you think about the whole point about the breeding program, excuse me, that the name Atreides is meant to take you all the way back, and if it does take you to either Agamemnon or Menelaus, then it has to take you to Atreus, and it has to take you to the very least to Pelops and his mother. So that's the point of that, I suppose. Excuse me, taking a wee sip here. My throat's a bit tickling. Yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking how we thought there, but yeah, there's a lot of subtlety in how it goes within the Dune series, and I think the interesting, the other interesting thing is we have multiple aspects of different characters within the Pelopids overlaid on top of different characters in Dune as well. So as much as what Agamemnon's a part of Leto, he's also a part of Paul, very much. And I think within the female characters, I think there's I think Jessica and Alia are kind of built up out of a number of these characters as well. There's something quite excuse me, something quite tragic about Alia, and I would say aspects of her character. There's bits of Iphigenia in her. There's bits of Electra in her. There's, I'd say, a fair chunk of Cassandra, that sense of doom in her, and obviously she's also Artemis, very much so to Paul's Apollo. So yeah, yeah, I actually think that the whole Trojan War thing's quite fun. It's I mean it is quite detailed, and there's all sorts that go on in it. But really, as I said, we haven't talked too much about it. And the one last thing I'll sort of leave you with tonight is that ultimately, where was Frank Herbert going with his story? And apparently, according to the 30 pages of notes or so on, how he wished to end this perpetual cycle of violence and the repetitional cycles that we get within the Atreides family and attached to the dangerous hero, is that my understanding is that he wanted to end it, and I don't know if it makes any kind of sense or not, in some kind of democratic fashion. If we understand these stories, and I was sort of trying to say, we were talking about the net at the end of Chapter House Dune. Well, that's it. I'm there, Babs. The net. Am I going to have to wait for the video for you to reveal your die? Well, I don't know. It's simply this. I'll tell you what it is. You are going to have to wait. You have to wait for the third one, actually, to get to that net. It's to do with how Agamemnon's murdered. And there are actually multiple stories about the net. And it was just in terms of who are the old couple. And if Frank Herbert really is mashing up these myths, then there's the old couple at the end, there's an identifier, I suppose. Particularly if it's to do with the net, and particularly if it's to do with the Atreides myth, because if we're heading towards this conclusion that supposedly in Frank's notes about that actually lines up with these stories, because at the end of what happens with Orestes is that we get a judgment. We get a court, civilizing process, which is meant to sort of be a kind of setup for Athenian democracy and so on. And again, this is what survives in certain plays that are written later. But the clue, I suppose, Babs, really is if there is something to do with that, who are the old couple? They either resemble Frank and Bev, but they also resemble Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. Who now I don't know where to go with it, but it was just why the net? Now how Agamemnon is killed is that he's I talk about very specific details, so I'll not give you all of them in the now, Babs, but I'll keep something for the video. But it's how he's killed, and it's to do with him bathing, and he's either presented with the idea. I think about a bath, like a sunken bathroom, if you like, rather than like what we think of as a bath, and a net over the entire ceiling coming down on him, where he's trussed up basically, and like that. But the other story is to do with a shirt, and it's a net. The shirt is also made it's a net. And the story is as he's getting out to dry, to put this on. The net has no sleeves. It's a shirt, but it has no head, no sleeves, and he gets tangled up in it. And this shirt that is like a net is used to kill him. So in terms of Cassandra's prophecies and where he was going, and is he going to finally end that spiral? In terms of the final death, I suppose the death is part of the curse, Babs. I don't know what you think, and maybe I'm just clutching at straws. But the net was kind of curious. And there, there's in terms of mythology, so that you can read a story, a mythological story, to someone and go, there you go, there's a nice story. In terms of the real meaning behind it, there's a bit more to it, Babs. But I don't know what you think. So a net is a net is and this is leading up to Orestes kind of finally sorting things out and bringing the family curse to an end. So a net is the how Agamemnon meets his death, and it's depending on how you think about it, it's either spread out along an entire room. So I don't know about you, Babs, but my main I have my own personal opinion that I think there's a lot of that. It's not necessarily going to follow events from the Oresteia, for example, from the last play. Um, but oh no, sorry, from the second play, isn't it? But there is something of that repetitious nature. And it's again with to do with Duncan Idaho, Minus Tag, etc. At the very end, what's going on? What's this net about? Who is this old couple? And what's the net got to do with anything? And it could be metaphorical. And I think we're told it's how who is seeing them? It's Duncan, isn't it? Or is it Duncan or is it Miles? I think it's Duncan. How he's seeing is how his mind is interpreting it, I think. Possibly as part of his I don't know what you think, Babs, by the way, if it is relevant or not. It's just if he was gonna well, I don't well, you see, it's not the send after it. It's the whole point of the net is it's a trap, and it's when you come home, I suppose. Yeah, Duncan can see them. And isn't it something to do with how? I don't know. It's part of me still thinks that it's. We've had a good chat about this, Babs. Part of me thinks that it's Frank and Bev. I think that there's a solipsistic possible. I don't know. I'll put it this way. If you think about God Emperor of Dune and the original three books, I think there's something about Frank Reid not. I think there's a frustration, Frank, where possibly he felt that his message wasn't getting out. That he uses to me to some extent. God Emperor of Dune is used to explain it to the readers who haven't figured it out yet. That we're bad. I haven't I? You know, even Leto is very much. I'm telling you, I'm really bad, and we still have this. This idea of them as heroes, etc. I don't know. It really does depend on if he was going to wrap things up. It ties in with the myth, but what it would symbolize, I don't know. So that was what I was thinking about. And well, what they are is basically this old. They're also part of the family. You have to understand. The two people I'm talking about are also Atreides to a degree. Well, not as in the sons of Atreus, but. Aegisthus, the guy we're talking about, is the son of the other brother, Thyestes. Clytemnestra is Agamemnon's wife. So, in terms of the story, if I was using the overlay of the Pelopid to take me a certain place within the narrative, that's where this story goes. And where the only thing that I was just going is I know that about the Atreides, etc. And we end Dune on this talking about nets and this couple. And simply, couple nets. So I don't know if it's just, it could be just one of those amazing, that's just a tiny little bit of quinky dinky, if you know what I mean. But we'll never know, sadly. And but I've often found that your little tiny details in Dune, the very tiny things that he doesn't want to tell you about, actually have much more payoff than when he's directing you to look at someone. If you see what I mean. But I don't know. And you have all of these myths are to do with prescience and forms of worship, I suppose. Yeah. And I suppose in terms of how he's killed, it's Babs, it's actually got to do with a whole bunch of other stuff, and I haven't really gone super into the explaining how mythology works and what it's about. But there's a particular event, and it's also to do with how Agamemnon's killed. He's neither clothed nor naked. He's got 1 foot in the bath, 1 foot on the ground. He is cut twice depending on who cuts him, and both weapons are double-edged weapons. With Aegisthus, it's a double-edged. It's the sword of Thyestes that kills Agamemnon, and if you take the other bit, the other myth, it's Clytemnestra kills him with a labrys, which is a double-headed axe and a symbol of Cretan royalty. So I don't know. It's that was it was a Daniel Marty clue. It's all to do with, well, there's different versions of it, but it's to do with this. And this is really where that comes from. And I'm not saying I'm not saying what it is, because I don't know. But I'm just going, it's got to be too much of a coincidence. And especially if we're thinking about if Frank was going to wrap up the story in book 7, which would kind of follow with the Orestes part of that myth, wrapping up that family line. And as I said, he's not taking every detail, but he's using the general sense of the stories. And I don't know, if the net was meant to kill Agamemnon, then is Frank setting up Duncan for the same fate? Well, it's absolutely meant to. Agamemnon's a very deadly man. By the way, he's not some. We get this idea of hello, kings modern day. To be king back then, king of Mycenae, he's a war leader, and probably is the guy that owns the most cattle, but he's also most likely a deadly fighter. Again, they're not. In fact, I would argue that most of them are pretty. Almost every character in the Iliad and the Odyssey are pretty. They're pretty deadly or pretty shit hot at something. Each of the heroes kind of has a different attribute, if you like. Odysseus is Odysseus is deceptive, lateral thinker, cunning, if you like. Cunning is Odysseus's main quality. Achilles is war. Simple. That's it. He does war better than anyone else. He's a killer. Achilles kills better than any other man on the earth. Nestor is the wise tutor, for example. They all have different attributes. Agamemnon tends to be a bit hot-headed and a bit stupid, greedy, I suppose. So he's not a nice character presented. He's not presented as particularly admirable in the Iliad, I think. Duncan was a sword master, like the most dangerous member of House Atreides. I was actually thinking about the whole shield combat thing the other day and thinking knives were not a good idea at all. I was thinking spears and the longer. I don't know. Yeah, and I suppose that's it. If you think about it, the Trojan War, I suppose, it's heroes and heroes. Paul's meant to be a hero surrounded by heroes. You'd argue, yeah, Duncan's kind of his Achilles, if you like. Who else have we got? Dr. Yui, and as much as he's probably the Trojan horse, but Thufir Hyatt is very much a Nestor type character, I think. Nestor's the old guy at the Trojan War who's wise and smart. Often commented about his age, but they bring him to the council. But yeah, it's the interesting thing about it, Babs, I suppose, is it's all a trap, and to entice Agamemnon in. But before even, I suppose, before he even goes into the bathhouse, the trick is to make him work on a purple carpet. It's about committing hubris to behave like he's a god. And once he does that, as you'll see with a lot of these stories, by the way, a lot of it is if you behave like a god, you commit hubris, and then the gods will you're doomed no matter what. So I don't know. It was just those details, and I just went net, and I'm thinking, different aspects of the characters, I suppose. Duncan's always the name Duncan also is. I don't know. Always thought it was a wee bit suggestive, but possibly again, Babs. And I'll leave you with this because I'm going to wrap up in a wee minute. But the way I think about it is, it depends on how you think Frank's going to go with his final book. Is he going to repeat? Give us the iteration, because I think partly Frank goes, I warned you about a hero once, and you love this hero. So I'm warned you again. I'm going to amplify that hero. Here's his dad, or here's his son. Sorry, check this out. It's even worse. And part of me thinks that he was always going to have that. He would just do that, make it worse. Duncan and the Millship may have been a kind of Trojan horse, something which appears harmless yet it gets inside your guard, turns deadly. The thing that every little flaw is, all I think in Dune is to do with the harmless thing that nobody pays attention to. And interestingly enough, I suppose, if you think about the Trojan horse and how it works, both houses fall because of a medical reason, if you like. So the Troy falls because technically the Greeks build the wooden horse, put 50 armed men inside it, but then they throw out a guy who's got the plague. And the reason why it's a Trojan horse is that the Trojans worship Poseidon, and the seahorse and horses are sacred to him. As you'll get a wee bit of that from the Pelops myth tonight. So the wooden horses, the Greeks meant to be appeasing the god, and they pretend that they've all got the plague and they're running home. And so the gates of Troy can't be taken because they were built by gods. So unfortunately, the Trojans are daft enough that they lift up the gates because the horse is too big. So they open their gates to let the thing in, and that's But there's a number of prophecies to do with the siege of Troy falling, and Odysseus and I think is it Ajax possibly go about trying to make some of them happen. But ultimately, if you think about how House Atreides falls, it's inside their own. Yeah, Dr. Yueh is the Trojan horse, definitely, and brings the shields down, I suppose. The thing that they're impenetrable shields, as long as this idea, Troy's kind of the same thing. As long as the Scamander gates stand, it shouldn't fall. So there's lots of. Funny enough, I put in a wee picture there tonight of it's a really good painting of the fall of Troy, and it almost matches up to some of the stuff in the battle in the David Lynch film. Mulship is kind of a Trojan horse, something which appears harmless or gets inside your guard, turns deadly. Absolutely, and that's the end of the Trojans basically at that point. Though of course Aeneas escapes with his father on his shoulder carrying a little statue of, is it the Palladium, of Athena, isn't it, I think. And that takes you on a whole other set of myths that goes up to the founding of Rome. And if you get, that's Augustus Caesar and Virgil writing the Aeneid to give him a divine lineage down to that. It does take you all over the place. And I don't know, it's a very interesting way of being killed, in particularly in mythology, and has a lot of meaning. Yeah, but it could be that he was set. I don't know. Was Duncan going to be our real hero and save the day, or was he going to be not again, even worse? And I think kind of not. I don't know. I don't really want to read the last two Brian Herbert, but the end of June again, the Sandworms of June and Hunters of June. But the super Deus Ex Machina, human god machine hybrids, all of this kind of thing. If he went with that, arguably, ultimately, what it does lead to, Babs, I suppose, is the last iteration of revenge. If you see what I mean, the net causes the last bit of it's the weapon to bring him down. I suppose it's one of two weapons. It's kind of got stuff to do with tanistry and the ritual killing of kings and so on. But ultimately, there's appeasement and an end put to it just after that. And in terms of what we'd heard about the notes, that it would be kind of, let's all sort this kind of thing out. The Landsraad, by the way, for example, are pretty much how the Landsrat operate is the same as the mutual pact of the kings of Greece over Helen of Troy. Um, as well. But yeah, there we go. There's an awful lot to it, and hopefully, as I suppose, at this point, we've got quite a lot of the myths and the Pelopid line to go through yet. And we'll start with Atreus himself. This is the house of Atreus. But Pelops already, we can see, offering up your bride for rape, or, there's murder, there's child sacrifice, there's beheadings. And and as I said, there's a reality to some of these things, particularly the chariot race, and what replaced it historically, I suppose. It's fascinating, and there's a lot to it, guys. It is really interesting, but where it could have went. But as I said, it was just it pinged in my head looking at some stuff recently, the net, and then of course because of the links between the Atreides family. Hello, Holly. There's my doggies just come in. Hello, pet. You all right? And I thought if the overlap of that family story is heading that way in the Dune series, and it goes all over the place, but fundamentally they're Atreides, and we're reminded of it quite a bit up as far as God Emperor anyway. Excuse me. Then there is a conclusion to that story. There is a conclusion to the cycle, a conclusion to the endless spiral of violence, which, I suppose it's all got to stop somewhere. But it's one of those things that you're heading to a sort of final climactic battle. I don't know. Sometimes I think a lot of this literature does sort of point towards, and maybe it's because of the influence of myth on science fiction and fantasy, but everybody and their mother seems to be fighting a battle at the end of the universe or the end of the world, You out there, sausage? Oh, oh yeah. Hello. Sorry, man. She's just... This is the big German Shepherd. What are you at? You okay? I'm about to say good night, so I'll come and pet you in a minute. Well, listen, folks, that's probably a good indicator for me to... your dinner awaits. No worries, Babs, and I'm going to call it a night. Thank you very much for checking in. We'll see you again next week, folks, with another episode on... We'll take the Pelopid line on and have a wee chat about it afterwards and keep sort of trying to bring it back to June. So in the meantime, I hope you're all safe wherever you are. Thanks very much for joining us, and I'm glad we got through it tonight without power cuts or explosions or all sorts. As I said, it's been an interesting week. So we'll see you on Friday next. Thanks very much. Good night. All the best. Where's your toys at? What are you at?